There is a train. It left Lahore in the early morning of August 1947. It was carrying families, farmers, teachers, children who had never been more than 20 miles from home. They were carrying whatever they could hold: a cooking pot, a photograph, a handful of soil from a garden they would never see again. The train was heading east, toward India, toward a country that had not yet finished being born. It never arrived. What arrived instead at a station called Mano Madra was silence. A train with its engine still running, its doors hanging open, and not a single living soul inside. The British called these the ghost trains. History has no word adequate enough for what they were. This is the story of how a border was drawn, how two nations were born, and how, in the space of a single summer, one of the largest and most catastrophic forced migrations in human history was set in motion, not by fate, not by ancient hatred, but by decisions made in offices, by men who would never have to live with the consequences. Every border has a history. This one has a body count. To understand 1947, you have to understand what Britain had built and what it had deliberately broken. By the mid-19th century, the British Raj controlled roughly 350 million people across a landmass that included modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma. It was, by any measure, the most complex administrative project in human history. Dozens of languages, hundreds of princely states, ancient trade networks that predated Rome. And it was held together in no small part by a principle the British had quietly turned into policy: divide and rule. This did not begin as a conspiracy. It became one slowly, through a series of administrative choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in combination. In 1905, the British partitioned Bengal, officially for administrative efficiency. The real effect was to split a province of 80 million people along religious lines, creating a Muslim-majority East Bengal and a Hindu-majority West Bengal. The outcry was so fierce that they reversed it 6 years later. But the lesson had been learned on both sides. The British had seen that communal division could be a useful lever, and Indian political leaders had seen that religion could mobilize people in a way that economic arguments alone could not. Then came the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, seemingly a liberal concession, more Indians in government. But buried inside the reform was something that would define the next 40 years of Indian politics. Separate electorates. Muslim voters would elect Muslim representatives. Hindu voters would elect Hindu ones. Think about what that means for a moment. Before 1909, a politician seeking votes in a mixed area had to appeal across religious lines. After 1909, he only had to appeal within them. The reform did not reflect communal division. It manufactured it. It made religious identity the primary unit of political organization, and then it rewarded whoever played that game most effectively. This is where the road to 1947 begins. Not in August of that year, not even in the 1940s. It begins in 1909, in a piece of legislation drafted by men who believed they were governing wisely, and who handed the subcontinent a time bomb wrapped in constitutional language. By the 1930s, two men had come to represent two irreconcilable visions for what India would become after the British left. Jawaharlal Nehru was the son of a prominent lawyer, educated in England, elegant, secular, and deeply committed to a vision of India as a multi-religious democracy. For Nehru, the nation was defined not by religion, but by history, geography, and the shared experience of colonization. He believed that Hindu and Muslim identity could coexist within a single constitutional framework, and that to organize a state around religion was to make a permanent prisoner of the past. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was equally formidable. Also trained as a lawyer, also secular in his personal habits. He rarely prayed, he drank occasionally, he wore Savile Row suits. In his early career, Jinnah had actually been a member of the Indian National Congress. He was known, at one point, as an ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. But by the 1930s, something had shifted. Jinnah had watched Congress win landslide victories in the 1937 provincial elections. He had watched Congress form governments across British India and, in his view, govern in ways that marginalized Muslim interests. He had watched the symbols, the language, and the culture of Congress-governed provinces tilt, sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly, toward the Hindu majority. Whether his fears were fully justified is a question historians still argue. What is not in question is that he acted on them. In 1940, the Muslim League passed the Lahore Resolution. It did not yet use the word Pakistan. It called for independent states in the Muslim-majority regions of the northwest and northeast of the subcontinent. The demand was born. And yet, and this is crucial, as late as 1946, Jinnah was still negotiating. The Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946 proposed a united India with significant provincial autonomy, something close to a confederation. Jinnah accepted it. The Muslim League accepted it. It was the Indian National Congress that rejected it. Congress, led at that point by Nehru and the hardliner Vallabhbhai Patel, refused to accept the constraints the plan would have placed on central government. They wanted a strong, unified Indian state. The Cabinet Mission Plan, the last real chance to avoid partition, collapsed not because the Muslims walked away, but because the Congress did. This is not a popular thing to say. It is, however, what the historical record shows, though historians continue to debate the weight of responsibility on each side. Partition was not made inevitable by one side alone. It was made inevitable by a sequence of failures: British manipulation of communal identity, Congress's inability to offer meaningful guarantees to Muslim communities, the Muslim League's increasingly hardline demands, and finally, the catastrophic miscalculation of rejecting the one plan that might have kept the subcontinent together. By August 1946, with the cabinet mission collapsed, violence had already begun. Jinnah declared August 16, 1946, as Direct Action Day. What followed in Kolkata was 3 days of communal carnage. Estimates put the dead at between 4,000 and 5,000. Hindus and Muslims turned on each other with a ferocity that shocked even those who had been warning of exactly this for years. The violence spread. Noack Kali, Bihar, Rawalpindi. Province by province, the idea that Hindus and Muslims could live together under one government was being destroyed, not by arguments but by bodies in the street. By the time Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in India as the last viceroy of the British Empire, in March 1947, there was no longer a question of whether India would be divided. The only question was how, and how fast. Lord Louis Mountbatten was 56 years old, immaculately dressed, and dangerously confident. He was a cousin of King George VI, a decorated naval commander and a man who had a gift, perhaps his most dangerous quality, for believing that he could solve in weeks what others had failed to solve in decades. He arrived with instructions to transfer power to an Indian government by June 1948. That gave him 15 months. He decided he needed fewer than 6. The reasons Mountbatten accelerated the timeline are still debated. He himself claimed the violence was spiraling toward civil war, and that speed was the only mercy. Critics, and there are many, argue that the rush served British interests. A fast exit meant fewer questions about the costs of colonialism, less accountability for the administration's failures, and a clean departure before the scale of the coming catastrophe became impossible to ignore. What we know for certain is this. In June 1947, Mountbatten announced that independence and partition would happen on August 15, 1947, 10 months ahead of schedule. The date was announced before the border was drawn. Let that settle. Hundreds of millions of people were told the country would be divided in 10 weeks. They were not told where the line would fall. They were not told which side of it they would be on. They were not told whether their village, their farm, their canal, their city, their life, would belong to India or Pakistan. They would find out 2 days after independence had already been declared. This was not an oversight. It was a choice. Mountbatten did not want the boundary announcement to overshadow the independence celebrations he intended to preside over in both Karachi and Delhi. He attended both ceremonies, 1 day apart, resplendent in his uniform, savoring the historic moment he had engineered. The border and its consequences could wait. While Nehru spoke of a tryst with destiny, 14 million people were already moving. His name was Sir Cyril Radcliffe. He was a barrister of the Inner Temple, a good one, respected, experienced, known for his precision and his impartiality. He had served as Director General of the Ministry of Information during the Second World War. He was, by any measure, a capable man. He had never been to India. Not once, Not for a holiday, not for a case, not for any reason. He had never stood in a Punjab village. He had never walked the banks of the Ravi or the Beas or the Sutlej. He did not speak Punjabi, Urdu, or Hindi. He arrived in India on July 8, 1947, carrying a mandate to draw a border through two of the most densely populated and religiously complex provinces on earth. He had 5 weeks. The Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, was the problem that would define history. Its population was 55% Muslim and 45% Hindu and Sikh, but those communities did not live in neat, separable blocks. They were interwoven. Villages with Muslim majorities had Hindu families whose ancestors had been there for generations. Towns with Sikh majorities had Muslim craftsmen who supplied their markets. Irrigation systems built under British rule crossed every possible demographic line. Radcliffe was given outdated census data. He was given imprecise maps. He was given 2 boundary commissions, one for Punjab, one for Bengal, each composed of 2 Muslim judges and 2 non-Muslim judges, who predictably voted 2 against 2 on every major question, leaving every difficult decision to Radcliffe alone. He did not visit the territories whose fate he was deciding. He worked in a government bungalow in Delhi. He had meetings. He studied maps. And on August 9th and 12th, 1947, he finalized his awards for Bengal and Punjab, respectively. Then he burned his papers. He refused the payment he was offered. He never returned to India. He never gave a public interview about what he had done. He died in 1977, having said almost nothing about 1947 for 30 years. The poet W.H. Auden wrote a poem imagining his voice. One line captures everything. I have no doubt I acted for the best. The Radcliffe line satisfied no one. It infuriated everyone. Lahore, the great Mughal city, the cultural capital of the Punjab, a city whose economy and civic institutions had been built equally by its Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities, went to Pakistan. Amritsar, the sacred city of the Sikhs, home to the Golden Temple, went to India, but was placed just miles from the new border. The Gurdaspur district, whose placement gave India its only land route to the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, was awarded to India despite having a Muslim-majority population. Whether this was strategic interference or a straightforward reading of the Commission's mandate is still debated among historians. What is not debated is that this single decision planted the seed of every Kashmir conflict that followed. And then there was the water. The British had done one genuinely extraordinary thing in the Punjab. Over 70 years, they had built the most elaborate canal irrigation system on Earth. The Punjab's rivers, the Indus, the Jhelum, the Chenab, the Ravi, the Beas, the Sutlej, fed a network of canals and control points that had turned some of the world's most fertile land into the breadbasket of the subcontinent. The system did not respect the Radcliffe line. It could not. Water does not read a boundary commission report. The headworks, the barrages, and control points that regulated the flow were placed, in several critical cases, on what became the Indian side of the border. The canals those headworks fed flowed west into what became Pakistan. In March 1948, less than 7 months after independence, India turned off the water. Without warning, without negotiation, India closed the sluice gates at the Ferozpur and Madhopur headworks. The canals that fed Pakistani Punjab ran dry. Crops failed. Farmers in a newly born country watched their fields turn to dust. India restored the flow 6 weeks later after Pakistan agreed to pay for it. A temporary agreement was signed, but the wound was open and it would not close. It took 13 years and the mediation of the World Bank to produce a permanent settlement. The Indus Waters Treaty of 1960 divided the 6 rivers between the 2 countries. India got the 3 eastern rivers. Pakistan got the 3 western ones. It was a remarkable piece of international diplomacy. It was also a treaty between 2 countries that had already fought a war over Kashmir and would fight 2 more. The rivers that Radcliffe's line bisected in 1947 are still, today, a source of existential tension. But the water was only the beginning. The British Raj was an integrated machine, and every part of it had to be divided. The Indian Army, 410,000 soldiers split between the 2 new countries according to religious identity. Muslim soldiers went to Pakistan. Hindu and Sikh soldiers went to India. In some cases, regiments that had trained together for years were told within weeks that they were now the armies of enemy states. The railways, 42,000 miles of track, thousands of locomotives, hundreds of thousands of carriages, stations, workshops, maintenance depots, divided. Lines that had carried goods and people across the subcontinent for generations were severed overnight. The Treasury, India and Pakistan's first act as independent nations, included a bitter argument over money. Pakistan was entitled to roughly 750 million rupees from the joint treasury. India initially refused to release it. Gandhi, who opposed partition and was by this point the conscience of the independence movement, threatened to fast until death unless the money was paid. It was. Gandhi was assassinated 6 months later by a Hindu nationalist who considered his sympathy for Muslims a betrayal. The roads, the telephone lines, the postal system, the civil service, everything was divided. Officials were asked to choose their country. Files were split. Furniture was catalogued and allocated. There are records of arguments about individual typewriters. One historian has described the scene as the British government's attempt to dismantle 100 years of integrated administration in 30 days, like trying to separate a bowl of mixed curry back into its original ingredients. Except the ingredients were human lives. No one had planned for this. Not Mountbatten, not Nehru, not Jinnah, not Radcliffe. Not a single official in the British government or the interim Indian government had drawn up a plan for what would happen when the border was announced and millions of people suddenly understood that they were on the wrong side of it. There was no organized population transfer. There was no international refugee agency waiting to receive them. There was no infrastructure, no camps, no food supply chain, no medical system capable of absorbing what was coming. What there was in the Punjab in August and September of 1947 was chaos. Muslims from East Punjab, what would become Indian Punjab, moved west. Hindus and Sikhs from West Punjab, what would become Pakistani Punjab, moved east. In the weeks following August 17th, when the Radcliffe Award was finally published, the movement became a flood. The columns stretched for miles. Some accounts describe a single refugee column in the Punjab that was 50 miles long, people and animals and carts, and bundled possessions moving in one direction as far as the eye could see, while another column of equal size moved in the opposite direction on the same road. People carried what they could. They left behind everything they could not carry. A farmer in what would become Pakistan left fields his family had farmed for 4 generations. He packed 2 changes of clothes, his children, and a tin box containing the deeds to land he would never see again. A teacher in Amritsar locked her school one morning and walked east, carrying her students' examination results in a cloth bag. She did not know where she was going. She did not know if her school would still exist when she got there. A family in Lahore, Muslim, professional, comfortable, left their house on a Tuesday morning with the belief that they would return in a few weeks, once the violence settled. They never returned. The house still stands. Someone else has lived in it for nearly 80 years. For those who left on foot, and millions did, the journey took weeks. The Punjab in August is brutally hot. There was little water along the refugee routes. Disease spread through the columns, cholera, dysentery. Children died of dehydration before their families reached the border. Those who managed to reach the trains faced a different danger. The railway had been the spine of the British Raj. It connected markets, moved armies, tied together a continent. In the summer of 1947, it became something else. Trains were the fastest way across the new border. They were also death traps. Armed groups waited at stations, at signal stops, at crossings where trains had to slow. They boarded locked carriages. They attacked with rifles, swords, and spears. Men were killed first. Women were abducted or killed. At Amritsar Station on September 22, 1947, a train carrying Muslim refugees was attacked as it arrived. 3,000 people were killed. A further 1,000 were wounded. Only 100 passengers escaped uninjured. At Kamoki, Pakistan, 2 days later, a train carrying between 3,000 and 3,500 Hindu and Sikh refugees was halted by a mob. The attack lasted 40 minutes. Estimates of the dead ranged from 400 to nearly the entire passenger list. 600 women and girls were abducted. And then there were the ghost trains. Trains dispatched from Lahore or Amritsar that arrived at their destinations with their engines still running, their doors swinging open, and compartment after compartment filled with the dead. No survivors, no witnesses who would speak, just the train, arriving on schedule, carrying its cargo of silence. The author Khushwant Singh, who wrote the novel Train to Pakistan, described one such train arriving at a small station with over 1,000 corpses, its engine blood-stained. On the side of one carriage, someone had written in almost casual handwriting, "A gift to India." On another train, headed the other direction, the message read, "A gift to Pakistan." This is what the border produced in its first weeks, not the orderly transfer of populations that Mountbatten had promised, not the peaceful dawn of two new nations. This. Trains full of the dead, arriving at stations with their engines running, in a country that had been born 6 weeks earlier. History records the death toll in numbers. What it records less well is what partition did specifically to women. The estimates are partial and deeply incomplete, because so much of what happened to women in 1947 was never reported, was actively hidden by families, or was erased from the historical record by shame and silence. But the outlines are known. An estimated 75,000 to 100,000 women were abducted, raped, or forcibly converted during the partition violence, on both sides, by members of all three communities. Women were killed by their own families to prevent abduction, framed at the time and since as the protection of family honor. In some villages, men killed their wives, daughters, and sisters before mobs arrived. There are accounts of women jumping into wells. The Indian and Pakistani governments in the years after partition launched official programs to recover abducted women and return them to their families. By 1954, over 30,000 women had been recovered through these programs. Many of them did not want to be recovered. They had built lives. They had children. They were being taken, a second time, from a home they had made. The 1947 Partition Archive has now collected over 10,000 oral history testimonies from survivors. Testimony after testimony documents women who carried the weight of 1947 in silence for decades. Women who never told their children what they had survived. Women who told their stories for the first time at 80 years old to a volunteer with a camera because someone had finally thought to ask. The cities hold the memory of what was lost. Lahore had been a Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh city simultaneously. Its old walled city contained temples, mosques, and Sikh shrines on the same narrow streets. Its great institutions, the colleges, the courts, the museums had been built by a colonial administration but populated and made real by all three communities. After 1947, the temples and Sikh shrines were abandoned or converted. The Hindu and Sikh communities that had animated them were gone. Lahore became a Pakistani city. It remains a magnificent one, but it is not what it was. And in Bengal, the division created a different kind of wound. The Bengali cultural world, one of the most intellectually and artistically rich on the subcontinent, was cut in two along a line that had no cultural logic whatsoever. East Bengal's jute was separated from West Bengal's mills. Farmers grew a crop whose market was now in another country. The economic damage rippled through both sides for a generation. Now let us try to hold the numbers steady for a moment. Between 12 and 20 million people were displaced. The estimates vary because no one was counting carefully, and because many of those displaced never registered anywhere, never arrived at a camp, never appeared in a record. Between 200,000 and 2 million people were killed. The range is that wide because the bodies were often not counted, the violence was often not reported, and the new governments of India and Pakistan had limited interest in compiling an accurate record of what had happened on their respective soils. The most careful modern estimates place the death toll at around 1 million, perhaps a little more. 1 million people. That is more than the total British military deaths in the Second World War. In 6 weeks. In a territory the British had governed for nearly 2 centuries and abandoned, 10 months ahead of schedule, with a border drawn in 5 weeks by a man who had never been there. Lord Mountbatten left India in June 1948. He received a hero's welcome in Britain. He was made a Viscount. He later became one of the most senior figures in the British military establishment. He was never called to account for 1947. Cyril Radcliffe returned to England immediately after the independence celebrations. He burned his papers. He refused payment. He was made a life peer and went on to a distinguished career in law and public life. He was never called to account for 1947. The people who were called to account were the ones who had no power over any of it. What did partition ultimately produce? Two nations that have fought 4 wars. Two nations that both possess nuclear weapons and have come, on at least 2 occasions, to the edge of using them. A Kashmir dispute that has killed tens of thousands since 1947 and remains one of the world's most dangerous unresolved conflicts. An Indus Waters Treaty currently under severe strain, governing rivers whose headworks Radcliffe's line bisected in 1947. And Bangladesh, East Pakistan, culturally Bengali, separated from West Pakistan by 1,000 miles of Indian territory, lasted 24 years before it tore itself apart in a liberation war in 1971 that killed hundreds of thousands. The borders of 1947 could not hold even the country those borders had created. There is a woman named Pritam Kaur. In 1947, she was 22 years old. She was from Gujranwala in what would become Pakistan. Her family put her on a train to Amritsar on the Indian side, carrying her 2-year-old brother on her lap and a single bag of possessions. One of those possessions was a Fulkari coat, an embroidered shawl, the kind that women in the Punjab made by hand across generations, stitched in patterns that carried the memory of the place where they were made. She made it to Amritsar. She made it to a refugee camp. She stood in a queue for food, hungry and exhausted, among thousands of others who had made the same crossing. And standing in that queue, she found the man she was supposed to have married, Bhagwan Singh. He had lost 3 brothers crossing from Miawali. He had nothing. She had the coat and the child on her arm. They married in the refugee camp. The coat is now in the Partition Museum in Amritsar. It sits in a glass case. It was donated by Pritam Kaur's family. She brought it with her from Gujranwala because it was a small comfort, she said, a reminder of happier days. It is also, although she did not say this, a piece of evidence. Evidence that she existed, that her family existed, that there was a world before the border and that it was worth remembering. Every border has a history. This one has a coat in a glass case, and 10,000 stories that nearly went untold, and rivers that are still being argued over, and a line drawn in 5 weeks by a man who burned his papers and never came back. And it has the trains. It has always had the trains.